Hello, my name is Anastasiya Fiadotava. I'm a junior research fellow at the Estonian Literary Museum. And today I would like to tell you about mother-in-law jokes. How do we use them? And what do they mean? This topic is one of the parts of my PhD thesis on Belarusian family folklore. Even though my primary data is based on a specific country, I hope that this presentation will be also interesting for those of you outside of this region. So, mother-in-law as a folklore character has been mentioned quite a while ago. The first mention of mother-in-law was recorded already in ancient Roman times. Juvenal, in his satire 6, has mentioned that it was impossible to live happily while a mother-in-law is still alive. Whether this can be considered as a good example of humor or not is up to you to decide, but jokes about mother-in-law has subsequently spread across different cultures all over the world. However, while mother-in-law is a prominent character, not any mother-in-law can be a butt of the joke. The jokes are almost exclusively about wife's mother, not husband's mother. Some languages do have this distinction between wife's mother and husband's mother, where others don't. But even in English, where mother-in-law can indicate both of them, this is clearly understandable that the joke is a confrontation between mother-in-law and her son-in-law. Despite the huge number of jokes on this topic, there is little serious folklore on the same matter. Have you ever heard any legends about mother-in-law? Any tales? Any riddles? Or maybe proverbs? Even if you have, they're definitely not as numerous as jokes are. So here we go by analyzing the jokes themselves. My research focus, as I have already mentioned, are mother-in-law jokes in Belarusian family folklore. And the analysis in today's presentation will be based on three main aspects. First, we will discuss the joke texts themselves and their topics. Then, we will look at the social or macro context in which these jokes emerged and spread. And finally, we will also look at personal or micro context in which these jokes are performed. Many of the jokes that I will cite and I have analyzed have been collected via interviews during my fieldwork for my PhD thesis. They were collected among 60 Belarusian families, but they do not only represent these families, but they are emblematic of many other settings and circumstances in which mother-in-law jokes can be told. A bonus in researching jokes via fieldwork was that I was able not only to record the joke texts, but also to record people's opinions and reflections on how these jokes are used and what they mean for them. Let's start with the joke texts. Jokes about wife's mother emerged in Belarus in the 20th century and become especially popular in its second half. A lot of joke books have been published since then, and now that internet is widely available, these jokes can be also found online. Some of the most popular topics of mother-in-law jokes in Belarusian family folklore include economic aspect of family relationships. And here's one of the examples. A mother-in-law and a son-in-law are having breakfast. The son-in-law is making himself a toast by spreading butter over a piece of bread. The mother-in-law says, "My dear son-in-law, do spread the butter, spread it." He says, "But I'm already spreading it." "No, dear, you're not spreading, you're piling it. Do spread it, spread it." Such jokes are especially prominent in the first half and the mid-20th century, and indicate the important role that mother-in-law played in the economic life of the newly formed family. However, economic function was not the only one she performed in the family. As this joke topic suggests, mother-in-law often interfered into family life and presented a threat to her sons-in-law masculinity. A son-in-law comes home. He says that the mother-in-law does not value him. So you come, hit the table with your fist. Who is the master in the house? He decides to try it. He comes to her, hits the table with his fist. Who is the master in this house? And the mother-in-law is cooking borscht, and she takes a ladle and hits the son-in-law in the forehead. He faints. At that moment, a neighbor comes in. The door was left open. She says, "Why is your son-in-law lying on the kitchen floor?" "I don't know. He's the master. He lies where he wants." In some of the jokes, unlike the two previous ones, mother-in-law don't really play an active role, but are just represented as a symbol of evilness. I took my mother-in-law to the serpentarium. She was watching the snakes with amusement, eating ice cream, mumbling something. Long story short, doing her best to pretend she didn't understand what those creatures were hissing about. As mother-in-law is an evil creature, it is quite obvious that one of the most popular topics in mother-in-law jokes are jokes about death and burial. A mother-in-law comes to her son-in-law and says, "Do whatever you want, but I want to be buried in the Kremlin wall." The following day, the son-in-law comes and says, "Do whatever you want, but the burial is tomorrow." So by this brief analysis of popular joke topics, we can figure out several important features of mother-in-law jokes in Belarusian folklore. Firstly, as I have said, mother-in-law is not always an active protagonist of the joke. Sometimes she doesn't even have any words to say in the dialogue of the joke characters, and in many cases she's just mentioned but isn't present during the event that is narrated in the joke. And secondly, mother-in-law jokes come close to gallows or dark humor. As I have said before, a lot of them are about death, burial, or any other ways to get rid of one's mother-in-law. A lot of scholars were interested in mother-in-law jokes and provided several interpretations of their meaning. One of the first interpretations was psychoanalytic interpretation suggested by Sigmund Freud, who wrote that mother-in-law jokes in fact reveal hidden incestuous inclinations of mother-in-law and their sons-in-law, which both of them try to suppress. This interpretation was supplemented by Emil Dreitzer with a cross-cultural comparison. He looked at American and Russian mother-in-law jokes and found out that the latter ones were much more cruel than the former. Another interpretation of mother-in-law jokes focused on their gender aspect. Pamela Cottrell noted that mother-in-law jokes help to maintain male dominance over the women, as they portray mothers-in-law in such a favorable light. Ruth Shade was also working on the same topic and added that jokes are used to reinforce negative imagery of older women and to negate them. Not only they denigrate all the females, but they are particularly controversial when it comes to older ladies. And finally, in his seminal paper, Christy Davis has suggested that mother-in-law jokes are best to be studied through comparative analysis of the jokes from different countries in different parts of the world. He also compared the mother-in-law jokes with other forms of mother-in-law folklore in the countries where mother-in-law jokes are not as prominent, as for example in India. He came to the conclusion that mother-in-law jokes are created by men who recognize the structural nature of tension with their mother-in-laws. They understand that the problem with interference or the economic dependence on mother-in-laws is not just their own, but is but a lot of men, other men, especially young men, are faced with the same problem, and this structural aspect gives birth to this impersonal, so to say, form as the jokes. And as you see, they are embedded in social context. So this is a social situation that mothers-in-law have some kind of power over a young family, and this social context gives birth to jokes. So if social context is indeed important, we should pay some attention to the one that I was researching. Belarus has been agricultural country, mainly agricultural country, before the October Revolution of 1917, and also for a couple of decades after it. It was also a patrilocal culture, which means that when a young girl got married, she usually joined her husband's household and left her parents. Then, since the 19th century, the number of nuclear families has been increasing, and it was especially prominent in the 20th century during the processes of urbanization, when a lot of families went to the cities and had their own jobs and didn't have to live with their extended family members to support themselves. However, due to the housing deficit in the USSR, which Belarus was also a part of, a lot of families still couldn't afford their own house or their own flat and continued to live with their in-laws, with their parents-in-law. And conditionally, nuclear families often depended and still depend on their parents, and especially the wife's parents. Her mother often comes to help her with the children while a woman is pursuing her career, because a lot of women in the 20th century Belarus and in the 21st century Belarus have a full-time job and cannot always rely on governmental facilities to take care of their children. So the mother's help and the mother's presence in her daughter's home is often very noticeable. However, today the role of in-laws is decreasing. A lot of families trying to live separately from their parents-in-law, and also one of the reasons why this might happen is that the age of marriage is increasing. People usually getting married after they have already built some kind of career, and also a high divorce rate, which also contributes to decrease in communication with the in-laws. And here we come to the third part of the analysis, to the personal context in which mother-in-law jokes are spread. A lot of my interviewees tended to relate jokes to their personal circumstances when they were telling me that. So, for example, telling me the jokes about mother-in-law, they would say that, oh, actually, I have heard this particular joke from my mother-in-law herself. She often tells me the joke, and we have quite a friendly relationships. Sometimes, though, my interviews said that they never tell mother-in-law jokes because their mother-in-laws are either deceased or have some kind of other issues or problems. And it was quite often that I have encountered negative attitudes to mother-in-law jokes. Such labels as ugly names or horrible stories were attached to mother-in-law jokes when my interviewees discussed them with me. And as you see, there is often a link between mother-in-law jokes, which depict mother-in-law in such an unfavorable light, and outward hostility towards mother-in-law. So, refusal to tell mother-in-law jokes might be explained by the refusal to have bad relationships with mother-in-law, to perform aggressive actions against mother-in-law. However, is it due to the jokes or parallel to them? Archetypically, good relations between the mother-in-law and the son-in-law are considered to be incongruous, and thus might provoke humor in personal relations. Some of my interviewees, who are sons-in-laws, said that they are sometimes calling their mothers-in-law with some nice names or using diminutives, and this in itself is funny because no one is supposed to be kind and gentle towards one's mother-in-law. However, mother-in-law jokes have not only been considered in the context of one's personal folklore, of one's personal family, and could be used also outside of its context and outside of the context of relationships with the mothers-in-law. For example, if we return to the joke about burial in the Kremlin wall that I have cited earlier, one of my interviewees, a university professor, said that he often cites these jokes to his students when he wants to emphasize that they have to do some assessment, they have to submit some assignment, no matter what. So he cites the punchline of the joke: do whatever you want, the burial is tomorrow. And thus the joke is completely decontextualized from his personal folklore and his relationship with his mother-in-law. An important aspect of mother-in-law jokes, as I have mentioned earlier, is the gender aspect. Both men and women in my interview sample drew parallels between the realm of jokes and the real world. However, the women tended to concentrate more on the content of the joke. They were looking at how mother-in-law is represented in this joke, and they were generally negatively they had a general negative attitude towards this joke because of their content, while men were more eager to explain the context of joke telling. They would tell me why and in which circumstances they would find telling these jokes appropriate, and would reflect on their experiences of telling these jokes. None of my interviewees have put mother-in-law jokes in a broader gender context, either by saying that these jokes denigrate women in general, or by claiming that they should not be taken personally by mothers-in-law. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that the vernacular interpretations of jokes is often very straightforward. So the borderline between jokes and aggression is blurry, and telling a joke might receive the same reaction as being aggressive and telling some and making some serious offense. The attitude towards mother-in-law jokes, however, depends both on the attitude to generic mother-in-law, and the relationships with the real mother-in-law. So the generic mother-in-law, this archetypical image of mother-in-law, is supposed to be cruel, bad, and evil, while a real mother-in-law might be gentle, helping, and non-intrusive at all. Thus, many of my interviewees have experienced certain tensions in their reflections on mother-in-law jokes, and had to negotiate their opinions and the ways and the circumstances of telling these jokes. As we see, the emergence of jokes is indeed a structural process, which is conditioned by the social reality of an important role of mothers-in-law in young families and in their dominating position in many cases, especially when childcare is considered. However, the performance of particular jokes in particular circumstances has also a personal dimension, and the family background and the family history plays an important role in how people interpret mother-in-law jokes and whether they are or are not willing to use them. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I will be happy if you reach me via email that you can see on this slide. And stay safe, take care, bye bye.